Trainees often claim that doing too much volume will result in wasted time and energy in the gym. It is claimed that there is a volume threshold, and if you perform more sets than this, you won't make any additional gains, and may even see worse muscle growth. This territory is often called junk volume. However, is there really such a thing as junk volume? And if so, where does this limit lie? In this video, we will try to answer these questions. First, we need to clarify what exactly we mean by volume. In the context of hypertrophy training, volume refers to the total number of hard sets performed per week for each muscle group. The reason we use total number of sets is because muscle growth can be equally achieved across a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads. So essentially, as long as we are training fairly close to failure in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range, then each set will be similarly hypertrophic. For example, if we take this training routine, we can calculate the volume for each muscle group. For chest and back, this would be 12 sets, for quads and hamstrings, we have 9 sets, and for biceps, triceps, shoulders, and calves, we have 8 sets. This total weekly volume can be manipulated in 3 different ways from a programming perspective. First, we can increase or decrease the number of sets for a particular exercise training a certain muscle group. Second, we can perform more or less exercises for that muscle group in each session. And third, we could train that muscle group more or less frequently throughout the week. In all cases, we are having an impact on total weekly volume. Now that we understand what volume is, we need to define what junk volume means. There are a few different definitions for this term, so it is important to understand exactly what we are talking about. In this video, we will define junk volume as additional volume that results in no additional muscle growth. We aren't referring to per session volume, and we aren't referring to junk volume for strength. We are specifically talking about weekly volume and its effects on muscle growth. So if we were to graph this, it may look something like this. The theory is that more volume is beneficial for muscle growth up to a certain threshold. Then performing more volume beyond this threshold will result in no additional muscle growth. Furthermore, some would even suggest that performing more volume beyond this point would result in less additional muscle growth. So anything past this amount of volume would be considered junk volume. Essentially, this hypothesis would suggest that you were basically wasting your time training with this much volume at best, or even having a negative impact on muscle growth at worst. So what we want to know is if this is really true, and at what point does more volume become junk volume? To answer this, we need to explore the relationship between volume and hypertrophy. We still don't conclusively understand this relationship, but there is plenty of evidence that we can draw from. First, let's look at this study which explored the effects of performing the same training program with 1 versus 3 versus 5 sets per exercise per training session. And what we can see is that there was a clear dose-response relationship where more volume resulted in more muscle growth for all muscles measured. And this was the case despite the high volume group training the quads with 45 weekly sets, which is more than almost anyone can practically perform each week. And this is not the only study which finds very high volume training to be effective for muscle growth. We have multiple other studies showing similar results. So as a whole, this body of evidence suggests that more volume tends to result in a faster rate of muscle growth. However, volume may not be linearly effective at promoting muscle growth. In other words, each additional set may not be proportionally beneficial. This was established in this systematic review, which analysed the evidence on low versus moderate versus high volume training. To put some numbers on this, the researchers defined low volume as less than 12 sets per week, moderate volume as 12 to 20 sets per week, and high volume as greater than 20 sets. It was found that moderate volumes tended to be significantly superior to low volumes, but high volume training was only marginally superior to moderate volumes. As we can see, there was a trend for high volume training to be superior for all muscles, but it only reached statistical significance for the triceps. So taking this evidence together, it seems that the volume hypertrophy relationship probably looks something like this. As we can see, more volume probably results in greater muscle growth, even up to very high levels. However, there is likely to be diminishing returns, where each additional set is probably less additionally hypertrophic. While this general trend probably describes the volume hypertrophy relationship for most people, we also need to realize that there is likely to be substantial variation between individuals. Like any other training variable, there is a bell curve shaped response to volume. The research tells us what the average findings are, but there are always outliers. Most people probably respond similarly to volume, but there are people who may respond better or worse to different training volumes. So in terms of the effect of volume on muscle growth, the general trend may still look the same, but the actual volume numbers may look different. Like we saw in the previous review, most people tend to respond quite well to volumes up to around 20 sets, and performing greater than 20 weekly sets per muscle group is probably less additionally effective, but still might have a small positive effect. However, for someone who is highly responsive to resistance training, we may see significant diminishing returns after only 10 sets per week. And someone who is less responsive to training may see significant gains up to around 30 sets per week. So what does all of this mean regarding the junk volume discussion? Well, from the evidence we have, there doesn't really seem to be such a thing as true junk volume. Rather, there is probably diminishing returns, where more volume may only result in marginally greater gains over time compared with substantially less volume. So rather than more volume having no effect or a negative effect, it may simply just not be worth the time and effort to perform more volume for very little additional growth. One way that true junk volume may exist is via its influence on other training variables. When we discuss volume, we always assume that all other variables are equated. However, in reality, when manipulating volume, other variables are often affected unintentionally. Generally, the more volume that we perform, the more time and energy it takes to complete our training sessions, so naturally our effort levels tend to diminish slightly. This means we may not have the same focus and effort on each set that we otherwise would if we had less volume. Furthermore, we may reduce rest periods between sets, since our sessions will now take longer with more volume. So what this means is that there is probably a natural trade-off between volume and lifting quality. So hypothetically, it could be possible that performing more volume could result in a worse hypertrophic stimulus as a result of poorer training quality. As an example to demonstrate this idea, this study compared the effects of performing bicep curls to failure versus not to failure. Trainees performed bicep curls in one of three conditions. Group 1 had trainees perform 3 sets to failure at 70% 1RM. Group 2 was 3 sets of 7 reps with 70% 1RM, and Group 3 was 4 sets of 7 at 70% 1RM. To equate this to an approximate reps in reserve rating, the two groups training not to failure were probably around 3 to 5 reps in reserve across the course of the sets. And as we can see, the group training to failure saw the most muscle growth. The group training not to failure with more volume was second best, and the group not training to failure with no additional volume saw the least hypertrophy. So even though one group trained with more sets, it still didn't make up for the lack of quality, which in this case was proximity to failure. So the take-home message here is that if volume is going to be increased, it shouldn't come at the expense of large sacrifices in quality. Quality should be the priority, and volume should be increased to a reasonable point based on your own individual tolerance. Another consideration that may indirectly result in junk volume is injury risk. Each joint only has a finite amount of stress that it can tolerate. If we stress the joint with too much workload, it can cause pain or irritation over time. Although hypertrophy training is usually quite joint friendly compared with other training methods, we can still reach a point of joint pain with high volume training. If we were to perform so much volume that we end up with painful or achy joints, then this is probably going to inhibit our ability to provide an adequate hypertrophy stimulus. So in some way, this could indirectly be considered junk volume because performing less volume would result in a greater muscle growth response. However, it should be noted that if you were training with strict technique, with appropriate exercise selection, and in the hypertrophy rep ranges, then you are unlikely to be limited in volume by joint stress. Rather, this is more of a concern for strength training, which generally has a higher injury risk than hypertrophy training. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, there doesn't seem to be truly such a thing as junk volume. Rather, there is probably diminishing returns, where more volume is less additionally effective. Furthermore, some people may experience significant diminishing returns with much lower volume, while others may require much higher volumes. However, true junk volume may occur through some indirect ways. First, junk volume may occur if a trainee sacrifices quality at the expense of more volume. Trainees may reduce rest periods, not train as close to failure, or lift with poorer technique as a result of training with high volumes. This could hypothetically result in an inferior hypertrophic stimulus. The other way that true junk volume may occur is via excessive joint stress. If a trainee increases volume too much to the point that they are developing pain or irritation in certain joints, then this may inhibit the ability to provide a good hypertrophic stimulus. In this case, trainees may be better off reducing volume to make training healthy and sustainable. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.